All right, let's turn in our Bibles tonight to 1 Timothy chapter number 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5, and we want to begin a chapter in which Paul is going to describe the essence of godly relationships, and I have suggested in our notes that this is a means of impact. The local church is obviously made up of relationships. When these relationships function as God intends for them to function, what we discover is these relationships achieve unity and glorify the Lord. Unfortunately, the opposite is also true. These relationships do not function in the way that they ought to. What we discover is that we experience disunity and do not glorify the Lord. Someone recently, I read a brief excerpt from a book in which the author described the difference between union and unity in marriage. And he used the illustration of taking a dog and a cat and tying their tails together and throwing them over a clothesline. They would be united, but they will not be functioning in a unified way, okay? And so there is a lot of difference between simply the union and being united in that regard. What we discover is that these kinds of relationships, in order to glorify the Lord and in order to achieve the unity, are going to require constant attention by all who are involved. You know as well as I know that the relationship will very quickly deteriorate if only one individual invests in that relationship. If neither of them invests in that relationship, then what you discover is that relationship will very quickly begin to deteriorate. Relationships take constant work and constant attention. Unfortunately, relationships among church members are not always perfect. At times we enjoy a great spirit of unity. At times there are other things that perhaps an issue needs to be addressed. And whenever that issue is addressed, feelings are oftentimes hurt. And now we start to deal with this reality of relationships. I want to say this, at least incidentally, that just because feelings are hurt does not mean that it was improperly addressed. Okay, take a child, for example, who is corrected. No child likes to be corrected. They will cry. They will have their feelings hurt. That does not, however, mean that the parent was wrong in addressing them. Okay, so we need to be careful on balancing all of this. Paul directs Timothy's attention to various relationships in 1 Timothy chapter 5 that were contained within this church at Ephesus. And he provided him with some instruction to achieve godly relationships. We'll note tonight verses 1 and 2 in which relationships individuals are going to be there, but we'll also see later on verses 3 all the way down through verse 16, you have the relationship towards the widows. And obviously the extent of the information that is given in 1 Timothy 5 would suggest this was a significant problem for these believers in Ephesus. As it finishes, there's the relationship between the pastor and the church, and how is that to function? And so what Paul establishes here in this chapter is that if we were to take and establish godly relationships and commit ourselves to those things, what we'll soon find is that as in and of itself is a means to be able to make the impact that God has intended. The Bible is filled with a number of metaphors that would describe the various relationships within the church. For example, Peter describes believers in 1 Peter 2 as lively stones that are built up into a spiritual house. A little bit later on in 1 Peter 2, he describes believers as the royal priesthood. Paul uses the image of a body in 1 Corinthians chapter number 12 to depict the varied but yet unified functions of believers. Well, there's another common metaphor to which Paul appeals frequently, and that's the one we find in 1 Timothy 5, and it is that of a spiritual family. Jesus actually established this relationship in a rather interesting dialogue that we find in Mark chapter number 3. If you study the context of Mark 3, you'll discover that Jesus was extremely busy. He called his disciples, he went out into the mountain, and still the people continued to follow him. And his mother and his brothers, physical brothers, wanted to meet with him. So we find this text in Mark chapter 3. There came then his brethren and his mother. Now we know that they would have shared the same mother, but obviously not the same father. And they were standing without, sent unto him, calling him, and the multitude sat about him. And they said, Behold, thy mother and thy brethren without seek for thee. Your family wants you. And he makes this statement, Who is my mother or my brethren? Jesus did not forget their names, nor did he forget their identity. But what he is telling us is that the relationship that he once had has now changed. And he says, he looks around about on them which sat about him and said, Behold, my mother and my brethren. In other words, as he looks out, he identifies these individuals who are there, my mother and thy brethren. For whosoever shall do the will of God, the same as my brother and my sister and my mother. In other words, what we discover is that this spiritual family individuals are placed into this by faith, and they demonstrate this relationship by obedience to his commands. The family relationship is a relationship that illustrates perfectly the manner in which these individuals are to be treated. It pictures a group of people whom the book of Psalms, chapter 133 and verse 1, would describe as those who dwell together in unity. It is a relationship that is to be characterized by love and not bickering. Such a relationship, however, does not seek to achieve love at all costs, but faithfully maintains and follows the clear teaching of the Word of God. It's not that we just set aside everything in order to try to achieve love. We follow the Word of God and we respond obediently to its teaching. And what we discover is that this kind of a relationship is a relationship of purity. It's a unique relationship in that it takes individuals from different backgrounds and different race and unites them into one family on the basis of the work of Jesus Christ on the cross. We, in our small group, have so many varied backgrounds that, humanly speaking, there is no way we should ever be united. There are some who came from the north. There are some who came from the northeast. There are some who were born and raised in the south. Those geographical distinctions alone say we should never be able to get along. We should never be able to have a fellowship where we would eat food together because the foods are often completely opposite. Take a look at your background just from a social standpoint. Some of you, for example, were saved at an early age. Some of you were saved at a later age. Some of you were brought up in circumstances that are undesirable for any to have to go through. But yet, through the work of God and through His grace and through the cross of Jesus Christ, here we sit in what I would say is a very unified group of people. That is an amazing thing in and of itself. What is the basis of it? The basis of it is not the fact that we had the willpower to try to achieve this kind of unity. The basis is in the fact of what Jesus Christ has done for us on the cross. And our faith in Him puts us in the family of God, and we all come in the exact same way. There are no preferences. There are no elevations where one person comes in higher than the rest. We all come in the same way. You've heard it stated that the ground is level at the foot of the cross. Now, in spite of the unity that is initially achieved, we also discover that the nature of the relationship is such that it has to be diligently maintained. In order for us to bring glory to God, believers who are within the family must devote themselves to striving to maintain an atmosphere of unity that is going to glorify God. It is at that point in time that those who are living outside the family are able to look and to see what it is that is going on. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 16. Let your light therefore so shine so that they may see your good works and do what? Glorify your Father which is in heaven. The unbelievers ought to be able to observe the lifestyle of the believer and immediately direct praise to God. They may not understand all of the theological implications of why that life has been changed, but they ought to be able to look at our lives, including our relationships, and recognize a change has taken place. And so if Timothy were to be an effective leader, he has to properly value those whom he is responsible for leading. The well-being of these relationships is critical to the success of his ministry, and what we'll discover in these first two verses is they are not limited to age, and they are not limited to sex. It's not whether you're young or old, whether you are male or female. There is a proper way in which these relationships are to be addressed, and that is what Paul addresses here in this particular passage. Timothy has to exemplify great wisdom in handling the many and varied relationships, and admittedly, some of the complications that are even going to come with these relationships. We'll see that later on when it comes to the matter of widows, honoring widows that are widows indeed, having to discern whether this widow is worthy of financial support or whether this one is not. Okay, you talk about treading in an area very lightly, and great wisdom that is necessary in that kind of a situation. Well, we want to begin tonight with this relationship to individuals. We begin in verse number 1, where the Bible says, "To rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren, the elder women as mothers, the younger as sisters, with all purity." Paul first directs Timothy's relationship now to individuals of all age and sex. Some commentators limit this instruction to the time when individuals have to be corrected. When I read through this, and I understand that the word there is rebuke, but I don't know that it is only going to be limited to correction. In fact, as I read through this and studied through it, that was not the initial way that my mind went whatsoever. I read some commentators that I greatly respect, and I kind of started thinking, well, maybe there's a point here, but I still come back to saying this is a mindset that is to characterize all of the relationships at all times. If correction is necessary, obviously it needs to entail that. But if it is not a time of correction, and it's just simply as a time of encouragement, for example, and that's going to be part of the nature of the word entreat, then I think it needs to characterize it at that point in time. So first of all, he addresses the elderly man. Now I have to say, before I even get into this, when I look out here, I do not see any elderly, male or female, okay? And so the only thing that I see is young. So young men and young ladies. And we are not treading that line, nor are we crossing that line where I suggest that some of you in here are elderly. No, okay? The elderly belong to some other church. The only ones in here are young, okay? So now that we've established that, he begins with this command, rebuke not an elder. At times, the term elder, especially throughout 1 Timothy, is used to describe the position of a pastor. It is the same word, but yet the context has to demand how we interpret this. So here we're not talking about the office of a pastor. We're talking about an elderly man or an aged man. The elderly, both male and female, are often mistreated by the younger. It's really quite a shame. A visit to a nursing home will illustrate this tragic reality quite perfectly. There are individuals who are often ignored and at times even regarded as inconvenient, as burdensome, or as an obligation. Their opinions are often regarded by the younger as unnecessary and outdated. How many times have, since all of us in here are younger, regarded someone else's opinion, who was an older one, like, who are you to tell me what to do? What son in here at times did not like his father's instruction. Often, even if he didn't say it, and I didn't say it, I thought it, but I was not dumb enough to say it, you don't know what you're talking about. Right? You ever thought that way? Dad is dumb as a box of rocks. My kids have thought that at times. In fact, come to think of it, they might still continue to think that, but we'll not go there. But they have thought, you know what? Dad has no clue what he's talking about. In some cases, that could be correct. In other cases, however, it was not correct. Why is it that we, as younger people, refuse to accept the lessons from the elder individual? We had to learn it the hard way. And then we beg our children, don't do what I did. Learn these lessons. What's the problem there? The problem is there is a very common disrespect or disregard for those who are older. We could add to this because in many cases they have unique needs that are oftentimes not understood by the younger. And it is, to be quite honest, easily ignored if it is not something that you understand or if it is not something that you experience. For example, loneliness. A male or female who has lost a spouse and is living alone, there can be a tremendous amount of struggles going through that. Someone that they shared their entire life with is no longer there. I read just recently of a 71-year-old or a 71-year married couple that died within 12 hours of each other. And the idea of truly dying of a broken heart is a real possibility. And that seems to be exactly what happened in that particular case. So here's this command, and he begins and he says, rebuke them not. And the word rebuke suggests to chastise or reprove very sharply with words. Chide them, for example. The nature of the command indicates this is not something that is to ever begin. Timothy, don't even begin to chastise, chide, or rebuke sharply an elderly man. Such a rebuke would obviously stem from an attitude of contempt towards that individual. If the basis of his command is that of correction, then Timothy is to never even begin to chastise him sharply when correcting the wrongdoing. I want to point out that Paul is not advocating that Timothy ignore the needed correction, but he is instructing Timothy to do so properly. However, I think that it is broader than that. It seems to me that Paul's instruction is simply designed to underscore his entire relationship with an elderly man. Do not address him sharply. Do not address him out of frustration. Sometimes we have the tendency in our hurried state to think things such as, get out of the way, you old man. We need to be very careful. You see? There may not necessarily be a correction there, but what we find is there is a mindset that is improper. Rather than sharply rebuking him, Timothy is commanded instead to continuously entreat him as a father. The word entreat is the verb form of the noun that's used to describe the Comforter as the Holy Spirit in John chapter 14, in John 14 through 16. Maybe you've heard the Greek term, your paraclete, that is thrown out there. This is the verb form of that same word. And it has a variety of meanings to it. And it's going to depend on how an individual receives it, or in the case, and sometimes, what the cause is for administering. For example, the word can mean to urge strongly, to appeal to, or perhaps to exhort. If we use it in this sense, what we would be saying is, here is a person who is passionately commanding and directing an individual towards certain action. Paul often says, I exhort that certain things be done. He is passionately directing, really on the verge of appealing to, even almost commanding to, just one step short of commanding to. There's another sense, though, in which the word can also mean to encourage or to come alongside and comfort. This is why I think that it's not limited just to correction. This would suggest there's a much different cause, and it would suggest a tender approach that is appropriate when dealing with this elderly man. You are, Timothy, he says, to never even begin to chastise him sharply. Instead, you are to continuously either exhort or encourage, just as though he were your own father. Now, within this particular culture, especially this culture more than our Western culture, and it still is the case in the Eastern culture as well, fathers were greatly revered and respected. In fact, in some cases, they are and still are regarded with a great sacredness by those who were within the family. You didn't disrespect a father or a grandfather. There was a mutual respect. It was just something that was ingrained within that culture. If Timothy were to demonstrate this kind of action towards this elderly man, he would have to have a respect in which that person is valued properly. That's ultimately where it comes down. When that takes place, this kind of an attitude recognizes and is sympathetic to the unique needs of this individual. If correction is necessary, he will do so in a careful and respectful manner. It's the only way that it can be done. So the first relationship is toward an elderly man. Be sure, Timothy, that it's proper. Then, the younger men, he says in verse 1, as brethren. These might be individuals who are younger than he, or they might be men that we might say are his peers or his equals. It's important that he treat the elderly properly, but it is also important that he treat the younger men properly. Leadership among peers is always an interesting thing. It oftentimes takes one of two extremes. Sometimes that leader authoritatively leads them by reminding them, I'm the boss, you can come my way or you can take the highway. But I'm the guy in charge. That's a fairly arrogant leadership oftentimes, and I would say it is very largely ineffective. It does very little to boost someone's morale. If someone were to come to you today and say, well, I tell you what, you can either sit in the pew the way I tell you to sit in the pew, or you can leave. What do you want to do? Nobody in their right mind is going to sit here and think, excuse me, sir, please tell me how you would like me to sit. This place would be emptied out so quickly because that's just not the way to talk. Now, I'm not saying that's our new nature, okay? It's the infamous draw the line across the front of the auditorium and say, don't you cross that line. It's the best way I could get everyone to come forward for an invitation, okay? Draw a line and say, during this invitation, don't you dare cross that line. Everybody will come forward, okay? We'll have the amazingly moving church service. What happens? That doesn't do anything to boost morality. But sometimes young people tend to lead that way, don't they? You have the experience, and they're among their peers, and so they have to try to establish themselves and say, well, this is how it's going to be. And that's one extreme. Often you go to another extreme as well, and that is the extreme where there is virtually no kind of leadership that is assumed. Instead, we're just going to function as buddies. And nobody's in charge. How well does that work? And maybe you've had a boss who would take that kind of leadership and they just want to be everyone's buddy. And by the way, there's a lot of difference between a friend and a buddy. Okay? A friend is going to tell you when you're wrong. So they don't necessarily associate the two, but the whole buddy system, that does not work well for leadership. Somebody's going to have to be in charge. So that doesn't provide any kind of solid basis for direction. And typically that's based on the popular opinion. Hey, well, we need to do this. Well, what do you feel like doing? What do you feel like doing? What do you feel like doing? What do you feel like? It's like the individual who, we'll say the dad in a home, who says, well, hey, all right, let's go out to eat. Where do you want to eat? What's the usual answer? I don't care. Pizza. That's not the usual answer in my home. Maybe it is in Nathan's place, but it's not in mine. Normally with mine, it's, I don't care. Whatever. I don't care. I actually have heard, I thought about starting a restaurant called I Don't Care. And I actually have heard that there is one that has started along those lines. I think it's a great idea. It certainly eliminates things. So, men, you've asked this question before in your car. Where would you like to go eat? And the answer is, I don't care. So you start thinking what you want. And then you have the audacity to go where you want. All of a sudden you discover everybody in that car cares. We need to have an altar call, all right? All of a sudden, everyone cares. And there was no leadership, so you assumed leadership. And lo and behold, that was the one restaurant they didn't want. I've attempted to not do this by restaurant. I've attempted to do this by food category. It still doesn't work, but it's at least a theory. I don't care, so then I can say, so you're fine with fish? No. Okay, see, we're making progress. Does that mean you want chicken? Chicken or burger? Okay, see, now we're making progress. If it's Sunday, we know it's not Chick-fil-A, okay? So we might be into Bojangles or we might be into Wendy's. If we got to start going beyond this, Mexican? I hate Mexican. Oh, I love Mexican. Now you ask the question, and now there's a fight because this one hates it and this one loves it. There's no leadership. So now here's Timothy leading younger men. Timothy, you're going to have to do so wisely. Lead them, he says, as brethren. Now, to get a proper understanding, supply the command from the word entreat. Entreat the elderly as a father, the younger men, entreat them as a brother. Encourage them, or, if necessary, exhort them, just as you would your own physical brother. Obviously, it is necessary and equally fitting that the younger individual be treated with proper care and respect. So you know what? Their opinions are to be valued, and their opinions are to be received properly. A foolish leader is one who ignores the opinions and ideas of those who are younger. Sometimes they have some very good ideas. Sometimes they have some very good opinions. Sometimes they have some terrible ideas and some even worse opinions. You have to exercise discernment in it, but lead them and treat them just as you would a brother. So obviously, verse 1 tells us that, Timothy, your care for these individuals is not to be based upon, nor is it to be governed by distinctions in age. Value that person, whether they are elder or whether they are younger. Then it moves on into verse number 2. The elder women. What do we do with them? It's not only unaffected by age, but it is also unaffected by sex, whether they're male or female. Having addressed how he leads the men, now how do you lead the women? Now here's a culture that downplayed women significantly and the role that they played. And it was vital that Timothy embrace this role as a leader, that he lead the women in a manner that would be honoring to the Lord and countercultural. If he values the women as Paul is instructing him to, that goes against everything within this culture. Do you think that that kind of leadership would stand out? Absolutely. Why does he do that? To bring honor and glory to the Lord. So we're not only worrying about leading the males, but also equally properly leading the females. Timothy then is commanded to entreat the elder women as mothers. Elderly women were not to be simply disregarded, nor were they to be treated as though they had no benefit or value. They were instead to be continuously exhorted. They were to be continuously encouraged, just as one would do so to his own mother. There is a value that is there, a respect that is there. She's not to be regarded as a bother or as a nuisance. There is a tenderness and a compassion that is to characterize his leadership. And again, I think that it's necessary, whether that is for correction or whether it is simply for encouragement. Then he goes to this final class in verse 2, the younger women as sisters, and he adds this with all purity. Just as the younger men were to be regarded as brothers from the same womb, the younger women are to be regarded as though they were his sisters. And it would naturally entail a respect and a care for these younger women. But I want you to notice this additional phrase, with all purity. The word purity here describes a moral excellence or a chastity. Here was what Paul recognized. Timothy, you're going to have to be very careful with ministering to the younger women that you do not fall into a moral trap. These dangers would be very natural as you minister to them. You would perhaps form a bond and soon be led into an immoral relationship. In order to help prevent that, Timothy had to establish and put firmly into place some guardrails of moral purity. And these guardrails would govern both his thoughts as well as his actions. Timothy, you're going to have to be above reproach morally to the younger women. When you skip down into verse 11, what we'll find out is that the younger widows were not to be the recipients of the financial care of the church, because they will he uses this phrase, wax wanton against Christ. They will, in essence, abandon Christ, and they will marry. Their desire is going to be to marry. Timothy, you're going to have to guard this very carefully in these relationships. And that's what Paul is saying. Here's Timothy. Timothy is the leader of this ministry. You're going to have these relationships towards individuals. And in order to fulfill what God's called you to fulfill, you're going to have to embrace this role. And the nature of that role naturally necessitates the importance of establishing sound relationships among the family of God. So Timothy, don't ever chastise or sharply rebuke an elderly man. Does that mean that you do not correct an elderly man who is guilty of wrongdoing? No, it does not. But you do so with a proper mindset. Instead, entreat, whether that be strongly exhort or whether that be encourage him, just as you would a father. Entreat the younger men, just as you would your own brother. Entreat the elderly women just as you would your own mother. Entreat the younger women just as you would a sister, but you have to set up these guidelines of purity. Treat all of them properly, regardless of their age and regardless of their success. And I believe his treatment of them would dictate the extent of his effectiveness. What do I mean by that? To the degree that he valued them properly, he would treat them properly. To the degree that he treated them properly, he would lead them effectively. Maybe you are a leader in some capacity here tonight. I want to challenge you to value those whom you lead, because your leadership is directly, the effectiveness of your leadership is directly hinged to the extent to which you value them and treat them properly. A person who abuses his authority will soon find himself leading a group that he has no following of. It's not going to work. But when you value them and treat them properly, you'll discover that leadership is often very effective. Sound leadership is built upon a proper recognition of the value of all people, regardless of their age and regardless of their sex. Timothy, you're in the midst of Ephesus and it's a hard work. You're going to have to lead people properly. The same thing, I think, can be applied to us today in multiple ways.